Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Jobs for Australia, a new call for full employment. I'm Emma Dawson. I'm the Executive Director here at Per Capita, and it's great to have you all with us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I come to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'm sure you'll join me in paying your respects to the elders in your community, wherever you may be. We are, wherever we're coming from in Australia, at least on this Zoom, on Indigenous land that was never ceded. We've got a packed program for you today, 3 hours of great discussion and participation, and we're looking forward to interacting with you, as many of you as possible. Hopefully I won't stumble too many times today. I'd like to start by thanking those people that have given their time to us today. The Honourable Wayne Swan, formerly the world's greatest treasurer, possibly still the world's greatest treasurer, Jed Carney MP, Andrew Lee MP, John Falzon and Michelle O'Neill, who'll be joining us a little bit later today. I'd also like to introduce you to my Per Capita colleagues who'll be hosting the breakout sessions. We will have Miffin Jordan and Abigail Lewis, who'll be talking to you all about social and community housing. Simone Casey, who'll be leading the session on employment services reform. Shirley Jackson, who'll be talking to all of you about manufacturing and industry policy. And Matthew Lloyd-Cape and Warwick Smith, who'll be leading the session on underemployment this afternoon. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Wayne Swan, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat about the history of full employment and how it really has been a legacy of the Labor Party in Australia going back, 75 years. Particularly the import of today's date, or actually tomorrow's date, is that it's the 75th anniversary of the tabling of the Curtin White Paper on full employment, which was really a blueprint that set Australia up for 30 years of prosperity, economic growth, and created probably the most stable middle class society on earth in those 30 years from 1945. So Wayne, good morning.
Good morning.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Great
to be here.
So we'll start by talking a little bit about the Curtin government and its plans for full employment and its agenda that created such a strong society in Australia in those 30 years. But we'll then go on to talk about some other developments, including Working Nation and, of course, your government's response to the global financial crisis, which at the moment, given that we're facing probably an economic shock, the likes of which we've never seen, will be relevant as well. But the Curtin Paper, I know you're very familiar with it, having done a lot of work in this area over the years. It was a really momentous day for Australia when that decision was taken.
It certainly was, and it's easy to underestimate just how revolutionary that paper was, because Australia had not known full employment at any time in its history. And that was particularly the case as we went through massive levels of unemployment in the Great Depression. And Australia didn't really achieve full employment until after the Second World War. So we had decades of high levels of unemployment. And for Chifley and Curtin to grab that opportunity, to start planning for the post-war reconstruction whilst they were in the heat of battle was terribly, was I think, very revolutionary. Because the orthodoxy at the time was, of course, austerity. That there was nothing that governments could really do about this. This was just the natural order of things. So after we've been through this 40-year period of neoliberalism, which has demonised government and the state and state intervention to assist people, I think we're a bit desensitised to just the important nature of that step that was taken here in Australia by Curtin and Chifley and post-war reconstruction, but also what occurred in the United States under the New Deal and Roosevelt, what occurred in Great Britain with the Beveridge Report, and indeed what happened post-war as well. I mean, people forget about what someone like Lyndon Johnson did in the United States. So underpinning this notion of full employment was the very powerful motivation that I think drives all of us on our side of politics. That is the power of the state to do something for a good society, not just a prosperous economy, a good society, and the importance of never losing sight of that. So when we're talking about full employment, we shouldn't underestimate that it's been done before. We shouldn't underestimate the forces arraigned to stop us doing it again. but it tells us that it's possible. And that's what's so inspiring about what they did with that paper 75 years ago.
75 years ago, it seems like a long time, but it is, of course, a lifetime for many people. And I think the point that you've made there is the critical one for me, which is this belief that has taken hold over the last 40 years of being told that there's no role for government, that government should get out of the way and let the market take care of everything. And as we know, that hasn't worked. It's left far too many people behind. Particularly in the years since the GFC, we've seen such a rise in underemployment, insecure work, and yet the top 5% are doing very, very well indeed. How do we reclaim that narrative when it's so embedded in the Australian psyche that debt is a bad thing at all times, even when we need government spending, and that there's no role for government? How do we get past that idea that if we're arguing for anything other than the market, we're arguing for some kind of big state socialism?
Right. Well, this pandemic gives us the opportunity to relitigate the case for full employment, because essentially a lack of revenue, not just here, but right around the world in both developed and developing countries, has hollowed out the capacity of governments to deal and respond to crises. And what it has done, I think, and this is what we have to be very aware of, it's exposed the stupidity, for example, of poking holes in the social safety net, in our health systems, in social security and training. And most particularly, I think it's shone a really bright light on the suppression of wages paid to our frontline workers. And what I'm talking about here is not the well-paid medical professionals. I'm talking about the cleaners and the drivers and the shop assistants. It shone a very bright light on the growing inequality that we have seen across Western democracies, a bright light on the consequences, if you like, of neoliberalism or trickle-down economics. And it's taught us this very important lesson if we had to learn it again. Our most important asset is our people. Our most important economic asset is our workforce. And it's taught us that the wealth creators aren't just the people, the CEOs who are sitting in the top floor of the building or issuing instructions. We're all wealth creators. We're all important. And that frontline workers, even when they're low paid, are just as important as the boss. So I think it hopefully has helped us spear this notion that a chief executive can be worth 200 or 300 times the average wage of his or her employees.
That's, I think, something that's got really out of control in the last couple of decades in particular. If you look at that post-war period, of course the boss always earned considerably more than the people on the shop floor, but it was maybe 5 or 10 times more, not 300 times more. And there needs to be a reckoning with that. Look, I agree with you. I think that this pandemic has really kind of exposed the fault lines in our economy and exposed the fault lines in that neoliberal project. And that people are recognising now that it is the people packing the shelves at the supermarkets and driving the delivery trucks, and those low-paid care workers as well, of course, early childhood workers, aged care workers, disability care workers, who are really on the front line. When we talk about creating full employment, there's a lot of different views around this. There's obviously a big move internationally for what's called the Green New Deal, and programs that can provide work to anyone who wants one, a job to anyone who wants one. One of the reasons that Per Capita is driving this program on Jobs for Australia and really putting it in the context of the post-war reconstruction and what Australia's done before is actually we were world leaders in this space at the time. We went to international bodies and argued for a full employment approach to the reconstruction after World War II. We don't need to take lessons from anyone else, do we?
We certainly don't, but we do need a new deal, and certainly part of that is a Green New Deal. I think you could call it a multicoloured New Deal, because we need it from top to bottom. Sure, renewable energy and its role in making our industry more efficient and achieving sustainability in the environment is absolutely critical, but it is not the only part of the New Deal that we need. If we look at what we need to do to achieve not only a prosperous economy, but a fairer society, the range of reforms has to be across a variety of areas. At its core has to be full employment. That full employment has to be driven by expansionary fiscal policy and also expansionary monetary policy. It also has to be driven by new industry policy. And particularly in this country, we've got the opportunity to use the best reserves of renewable energy in the world to drive that industry policy. But it's also got to be driven by a progressive tax system, which gives us the funds to put in place the social safety nets, which are so essential in health and training and so on. So I think if we want to deal, if you like, with the poison of neoliberalism or trickle-down economics, we've absolutely got to ensure that there's a stronger voice for labour, and that will drive full employment. We've got to ensure that we have a progressive tax system that can adequately fund our health systems, our education and training systems. So the two really critical areas here for me are a stronger voice for labour, which underpins the move to full employment in all its policy consequences, and a much more progressive tax system to drive the investment in physical and human capital that delivers both the productivity and the social fairness we aspire to.
Both very, I think that they are really the critical points. And I think I would add into that, as you referred to, having a strong progressive tax system allows us to not only build and invest in our economy, but also to provide a strong social safety net for those people who need it when they can't work for any reason. And of course, that was something else that came out of those years in the immediate post-war period, was the creation and the strengthening of that social safety net, and the creation of the Commonwealth Employment Service that actually actively helped people get into work, and also a huge program of investment in building of public housing, which increased the rate of home ownership amongst nothing else, having put upward pressure on the housing market by over 10% in a decade. So I guess one of the challenges here for us is that we know we can learn lessons from the Reconstruction, but we do live in very different times now. We live in a globalised, open economy. We have a much more multicultural society. There are women in the workforce as well, of course, in much greater numbers than there were in the post-war period. And also we have huge issues to grapple with in our First Nations communities and the employment and job opportunities for them. Something that Nugget Coombs, who really drove a lot of this agenda, along with Curtin and Chifley, felt very strongly that he wanted to try to do, but of course was stymied by a lack of constitutional responsibility at the federal level for First Nations people. That's a comment rather than a question, Wayne. Can you talk a little bit more? I know you were very involved in the early 90s returning full employment program in the Keating government, Working Nation. And that was an attempt, perhaps a short-lived attempt given the outcome of the 96 election, to restore full employment again about 25 years ago.
I've got my copy here today.
Fantastic.
Because I chaired the caucus committee. When I was first elected to Parliament, unemployment in Australia was 11%. And that haunted me, that level of unemployment as a new member of Parliament, because I was acutely aware of what Australia didn't do in response to the Great Depression, which saw millions of Australians thrown on the scrap heap, communities destroyed, individuals that never recovered. And I was absolutely determined to be part of a policy-making process that tried to ensure that would never, ever happen again. And the tragedy, if you like, of what happened in the early 90s recession was that policy program that came out of Working Nation arrived a year or two too late. And we recognised that it was an important program, but too much time went on between the unemployment that rose high and the response that came a little too late. And that was something that was to the fore of my thinking when we were suddenly confronted, and I was suddenly confronted as Treasurer, with the global financial crisis. We were absolutely determined that we had learnt in the lessons of what occurred in the Great Depression, that we'd learnt the lessons of what occurred in the recession of the 90s, where there were people who were unemployed in the 90s that I knew who never worked again. So we were determined to go early, to go hard, and to use overwhelming force to combat the massive levels of unemployment that eventuated right around the world. we decided that we could not risk what had occurred in those past failures where austerity had prevailed. And why that's important for today is that austerity did prevail after the global financial crisis and the Great Recession in all other developed countries, bar Australia. One of the reasons we came out of the Great Recession in such good nick is that we did use overwhelming force. Unfortunately, across the rest of the developed world, austerity prevailed in Britain and the US. The stimulus was withdrawn, and they went on for years with double-digit or very high levels of unemployment, and we've seen the political consequence of that. Big economic shocks have big political consequences, and after the Great Recession, that meant Donald Trump, Brexit, and the rise of authoritarian leaders in Europe.
Yeah, and in the UK in particular, where I'm originally from, it's been incredibly distressing, I think, to see the impact of those austerity measures over the last decade or so, and to find that not only is it the unemployment that's an issue, but the level of underemployment and the fact that 1 in 5 working families now in the UK are living in poverty. There is, I think, a real danger that we slip back into austerity measures.
You're right. Very much so.
The Treasurer's speech on what should have been Budget Day a couple of weeks ago to the Parliament was over 3,000 words, and he didn't use the word stimulus once. And I'm particularly concerned about that, Wayne, because I think there's a view that there's been this massive stimulatory response by the government. Nothing they've spent so far has actually been a stimulus spending. It's been life support for the economy. Don't we really need to see significant government support now to get our economy out of what's going to be this massive depression?
Absolutely, we do. It is just life support, important life support, which we suggested, and they eventually supported reluctantly. But we need some traditional stimulus. Medium-term stimulus, not just for 6 months or 9 months, because we're in a fight here with confidence. And the figures that came out yesterday from the Reserve Bank showing the acute levels of fear about job security in the Australian workforce, if they are not countered by a strong, proud public program driving job creation in Australia and seen to be doing it over a long period of time, wallets will stay shut, confidence will go down, and unemployment will continue to go up. So what is absolutely critical for our country now, as outlined refreshingly by the Governor of the Reserve Bank yesterday, is that confidence is lifted by the government in an early way, indicating its plans not just through to September, but through for the next year or two. If it's not prepared to put in place a suite of measures which deliver stimulus, particularly in construction, but far wider than that, then I fear for the future of our country.
I share that fear, and you and I have talked about this, that the Prime Minister's speech to the Press Club earlier this week has provoked what I find to be an extraordinary response by Australia, particularly by political commentators and journalists, that somehow tinkering with industrial relations reform is some kind of economic a miracle that's going to rescue the economy, and to have it compared to the Accord, which is bizarre to me. What are your views about that program?
Well, it's bizarre, I have to agree, that the coverage of this event was in the context that somehow this would secure employment off into the future, as if a talk fest and 5 committees, which could be quite important and may come up with some good outcomes, which will be good for the country in the long term, as if that's somehow a substitute for concrete positive action to keep people in jobs and the doors of business open, I find quite bizarre. I mean, it was really like he was sort of in the circus, mesmerising a whole lot of people about what he's going to do in the next 12 or 18 months, when in truth, even if it works properly, even if its outcomes are excellent, it is meaningless in many ways to the immediate and mid-term challenge that the country faces, which is to keep people in jobs and to keep business open.
Yeah, my fear, and I think you share it, is that by the time, even if they come up with some really terrific reforms to workplace relations, by the time they actually hit the economy, there won't be much of an economy left.
No, but it underestimates the role that the demand plays. And if you're not a believer in stimulus, then you underestimate the critical role that demand plays. the fact is we've seen the biggest fall in global demand since the Great Depression, and it is going to produce very high levels of unemployment. Unless you directly outline that challenge and directly say how in the immediate term you are going to lift that level of demand, what employer will have any confidence to keep workers on over a prolonged period of time? What people still say to me in the street today, when I wander around, I have people regularly come up to me and say things like, I'm a small business person. If it wasn't for the fact that I got some work out of the school program or the social housing program that Labor put in place in the response to the global financial crisis, which ran over a 2 to 3 year period, I wouldn't be where I am today. People say this to this very day, you know, 10 years or so on from then, people still remember it. They're not going to remember anything if we don't see, bar, if you like, some pretty terrible conditions, if we don't see the government pretty soon make some forward-looking commitments to give people confidence about the future. They leave it until September itself, there's an even bigger problem.
Yeah, I'm very concerned that that's what we're looking at, and that one of the things Per Capita has been trying to push over the last few weeks, of course, is to get some perspective about the size of the debt that we're taking on. It's necessary for governments to take on debt in a downturn like this, and given the level of interest rates at the moment, it's virtually like borrowing money for free, isn't it?
Yes, well, the Governor of the Reserve Bank before the pandemic hit was advising the government to be part of a very substantial program of investment, both public and private, in critical infrastructure. Because we shouldn't forget, as the economy went into this pandemic, it was already weak and at risk of a negative number. So it's a good time to borrow money at low rates to invest in the productive capacity of the nation, both physical and human. And we ought to be doing that. But yes, debt needs to be paid off. We do need to be concerned about its levels. But if we get the economy growing strongly, then we will pay that down, because the alternative to that is even higher levels of debt. The alternative to no stimulus is higher debt for the future, not lower debt.
Correct. So I'm going to throw this open for some questions now. We've got you for another 20 minutes or so, and I don't want to hog all of your time. So there are various people on the link today. We've got a couple of hundred people joined us already. And I'm going to throw to Cate Cooper, who's got a question for you. Cate, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I can. I'd like to know how many people are going to be employed of those that have recently lost their jobs, the tourism, the arts, the air hostesses, the hospitality industry. How many of those people will be re-employed in a gas-fired recovery?
Well, hi, Cate, and thanks for your question. Part of the problem here, and this is why it's so bizarre, the government has not produced really any substantial numbers, either in terms of budget or forecast, for us to analyse at all. We are seriously at risk on the current policy platform from them of well over 1 million people obviously not able to work. We know the figure is of that order. So what we have to do is to find the investment that we need in the jobs of the future, as well as the traditional jobs. We can't do a lot about international borders, which has a dramatic impact on tourism, and therefore we have to be creating alternative jobs in other sectors, whether it's domestic tourism or elsewhere. And it will be folly if the government's sole industry policy is to rely solely on a gas-led industry recovery. We need a mix of technologies which over time expand renewable energy across all areas of our economy, but particularly in the manufacturing sector. We know from the work of Ross Garnaut that that will give us a comparative advantage in international terms, in international terms over time. And we should see, particularly in the renewable energy sector, a continued use and an increase in generation in that area. But that can only happen with a much more accommodative policy from the federal government. So if their only policy in energy is to expand gas, and they're not concerned with what happens in the area of renewables, then they've got a problem, and we won't maximise the number of jobs we need to maximise from reforms in the area of energy.
Thanks, Wayne. A question from Simon Miller. Simon, g'day, how are you? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
No problem. Hi, Emma. Thanks very much for having me. Wayne, thanks very much for your remarks. Wayne, as an industrial advisor with an organisation that's both a union and professional association, I note your reference to a stronger voice for Labor. How do you think we should go about bringing that about?
Well, I think this current crisis gives us an opportunity to reinforce, if you like, the importance of every single worker to our productivity and to the health of our economy and our society. And we need to be much louder, if you like, and prouder in our discussions about that and the policy frameworks that we develop. So we obviously need to do something about strengthening the bargaining power of workers, and that means changes to collective bargaining. We obviously need to ensure that we strengthen over time the minimum wage and move that to a living wage. I think that's critical. But outside of the areas of pure industrial relations, we have not done enough, and we certainly didn't do enough, and I didn't do enough as Treasurer, to amplify the voice of workers more broadly across our society. And I think we should be certainly looking at the appointment of trade unionists to important bodies in our society. It doesn't happen anymore, and indeed we have a government that's refused to talk to the union movement for 7 years. But we should be looking at things like union representatives on the ABC board, for example, just to name one. I think we do need to be having a really, really good look at workers' representatives on boards more generally across the whole of the private sector. And I think there needs to be a fresh look at this imbalance in the pay arrangements and the obscenity of higher and higher levels of executive pay. So there's a few issues across all those areas, but it's not just the pure industrial relations issues that we need to attend to amplify the voice of Labor. It's got to be far broader than that.
Thanks, Wayne. Lachlan McCall, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, my friend?
Sure, no worries. Thanks, Emma. I was going to save this actually for the panel with Jed and Andrew Lee, but probably who better to ask than Wayne. Obviously, Wayne, you've spent your career fighting against injustices against workers. I wanted to essentially ask, is the NAIRU really a morally acceptable definition or intellectually honest definition of full employment in a modern economy where essentially we deliberately create a pool of unemployed workers, we deliberately maintain them as a pool of unemployed workers as a counter-inflationary measure? And can that really be morally defended anymore in a world where we know there are far more efficient and far more socially just alternatives like the employment buffer stock and the kinds of ideas that have been supported now by mainstream economists like John Quiggin and various others?
Well, I think we should be doing everything we possibly can to get the unemployment level as low as possible, and we could have an academic debate about what that may be. You know, if I had to pull a figure out of the air and say, well, you know, what does full employment really mean? Well, it should mean everyone in work who can work. If you're looking for a figure for it, I think nothing over 3% is acceptable. Something like that. I mean, I'm not absolutely fixed on that, and I understand the nature of the debate that you're talking about. But ultimately, the rubber hits the road, and people ask you to put a number on the line. Well, I say around 3. That's what I think. As a matter of practicality, I mean, people are moving in and out, as we know even now, of work and into other jobs. There's a hell of a lot of movement. So at any one time, there's always going to be some people that aren't in the labour market for a whole variety of reasons. So I would say around 3%. And to achieve that, we've got to do a lot of things across all those areas that I spoke about before.
A related question on this issue, and thanks for that, Lachlan. We will obviously be talking about that a little bit more with Andrew Lee and Jed Carney in about 15 minutes. But a related question from Ali Amin. Ali, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? You're still there?
Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead.
I would just ask.
Oh, you've got some problem with your audio there, I think, Ali. I'm going to ask you a question for you because I've got it written down here and we can't hear you. Ali's an active ALP member and the National Union of Students Welfare Officer, and wanted to ask whether Wayne supports a job guarantee in which the government would act as an employer of last resort.
I support the objective, Ali, of a job guarantee, but I don't know that we could actually meet your objective of guaranteeing everyone individually a job at any one particular point in time, which is why I nominated before an unemployment level of roughly 3%. My view is that we ought to be doing everything everything we can across all of the policy fronts to take any of the spare capacity out of the labour market, and that has to be our objective. And as I said before, I think if you wanted to rule a line around a number, it would be around 3%.
Thanks, Wayne. At this point, I'm going to bring in Professor Janet McColman from the University of Melbourne, and hopefully John Langmore is also on the line. Janet and John, if you're there, can you unmute yourselves, please? Of course, Janet's got some particular expertise as a historian in understanding the post-war period and what was done then. And John, of course, was one of the early architects of the real Accord, not the false Scott Morrison Accord that we've been talking about this year. Janet, I'm going to throw to you first if you're there. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Hello, there you are.
Hello, yes, greetings.
Greetings. You wanted to bring up the issue of rural Australia during the Reconstruction.
Yes, I do, because, we've got the climate emergency. The World Food Programme has announced that this will be the worst year for food supplies globally since 1945, when there was widespread famine. We can also take some inspiration from the Netherlands, which, tiny and soggy as it is the world's second largest export. And that rural reconstruction, which they took a lot of attention, made a lot of attention to post-war, but didn't get it all done because Sam Wadden's big report didn't come in until after they lost the election. But I would think that central to what we're doing is rural reconstruction that involves thinking about new ways of doing food, of protecting the environment, rebuilding rural communities. That's where the poverty is. That's where the unemployment has been so severe and intergenerational. And that we can do all sorts of things which are very clever. What we have now, which they didn't have in 1945, is an educated population. And the other thing which matters is that what emerged from post-war reconstruction and was being cut back in the last 30 to 40 years was the role of the state in providing jobs. And that benefited two groups of people, unskilled men who for the first time in Australian history had secured jobs in places like the SEC, so that's Victorian, electricity provision, railways and so on. And for middle-class people to have jobs at all. One of the things that when you look back into the 30s and before, there was no work for the middle class because there was hardly any administration. The professions like nursing and teaching were actually extremely small. And the public service would not take graduates. You had only entered the public service at the age of 16 as a cadet. So we were a very uneducated, unqualified, unskilled population. And what government has done is been able to create a middle class. Now, by practicing austerity and cutting back on the state, we've actually also undercut and cut back on the middle class. And that's where we see the terrible unemployment amongst young people, including graduates. Your thoughts on those?
Well, I agree with just about all of that, and I'll be interested to learn a bit more about rural reconstruction during that period. My family were soldier war settlers after World War I, all forced off the land into the Depression, and that was a pretty common experience. And that was the vision I had in my head as I grew up, and it was also the vision I had there when we were presented with the sort of circumstances we were in 2008. But I also think that for a whole variety of reasons, the march of technology and so on, that there is a much, much brighter future for our regions if we can harness the policy ideas of the nature that you've just talked about before. It's a matter of profound regret that the party that's supposed to look after the regions in this country, where some of the poorest people in this country live, is completely bereft of any policy platform in that area. And the only thing it can come up with is new coal-fired power stations located in areas where there is abundant renewable energy. So I think that, you know, their cupboard is bare, and there's a lot more to be done in this area. And I wouldn't mind having a yarn with you at some other time about all of your ideas. Thanks.
I think we can facilitate that for you, can't we, Janet? Definitely. But I'd like also now to bring in Professor John Langmore, also currently with the University of Melbourne, former Labor MP, of course. And John, I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on the early days of the Accord, and particularly to reflect on this idea that what Scott Morrison announced the other day was in any way anything like the Accord.
Well, of course, it wasn't at all, Emma, and nor has the newspaper discussion of the Accord. The thing about the Accord was that it was very carefully negotiated by parties who trusted each other, and then took the proposal to, after it had been through all parts of the Labor movement, took it to the Australian people in the election. They were elected, and then immediately they had the National Economic Summit. And the point of this summit was to ensure that these proposals were accepted by the influential people in the rest of the community, the business community in particular, but also the civil society. And the National Economic Summit was historically important. People who write about the Accord without recognizing the importance of the summit don't understand the whole political process that the Accord went through. And it wasn't a static document either, because what it did was set up a process for discussions between the government and the unions and the business community each time there was a proposal for a wage increase. And also each time a budget was being prepared, because there was the centerpiece of the Accord was the trade-off between wage restraint and expansion of government outlays. There was no talk of austerity. It was the stimulus that Wayne was talking about absolutely rightly earlier, which was so important. And that stimulus went on through the 6 years that the Accord, the full Accord was in operation. And it had the effect that was promised. It steadily reduced inflation and it steadily reduced unemployment simultaneously. But the reason that it worked was that the parties trusted each other. And that was centrally important.
Thanks, John. And Wayne, I'll get you to respond to that. But before you do, I just wanted to raise the bizarre opinion piece that was published in The Age and Sydney Morning Herald yesterday by Prue Goward, where she has alleged that one of the reasons Hawke was able to do what he did was that he inherited economic stability from the previous government, which I found staggering, given that actually what he inherited from Fraser and his treasurer John Howard was rampant inflation, rampant unemployment, suppressed wage growth, very, very similar conditions to that which we saw before this pandemic hit, actually. So with that in mind, would you like to just reflect a little bit on the Accord and John's thoughts about that?
Well, John and I were both at the Economic Summit, and we were also around Labor policy making well before that. And this question of jobs then was very much to the forefront of all of the considerations of both the Hayden opposition and then the Hawke government. And the whole policy framework there had very much to the fore the notion of full employment and how we got back there, because essentially the consensus over full employment in this country collapsed post-Whitlam. And we haven't quite got back there yet. But that period was a period of very high unemployment, particularly very high youth unemployment. And the process that John then outlined about how the Hawke government took that on in an innovative and quite spectacular way is also another example of the capacity of the Labor Party to be innovative and to respond to circumstances and still be true to our values.
Thanks, Wayne. Look, we're coming up to 11:45, at which point we're going to say goodbye to Wayne and well, hopefully you'll be able to hang around, but we'll be introducing Jed Carney and Andrew Lee for our next discussion. Before we do that, I did want to make a small announcement while I've got Janet and John here with us, which is that Janet and I are co-editing a book called What Happens Next? Reconstructing Australia After COVID-19, to which John is one of our esteemed contributors. And it will look back at the post-war reconstruction, but also look ahead, primarily look ahead to what's needed to rebuild our economy in a way that is both sustainable, ecologically and economically sustainable, and fair. We've got some fantastic people contributing to that book, and we'll be making a formal announcement about it very shortly, but it will be out in September, and it's a Per Capita publication in partnership with Melbourne University Press. So we'll keep you informed about that, but you can all join our newsletter and hear more very shortly. Thank you, Wayne, for your time this morning. It's been a really important and fascinating discussion, and I really am very grateful to you for making the time.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
Thanks. Before we do move to the next session, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping, and I'm not very good at this stuff, but I'll do my best. We are, of course, having some breakout sessions at about 12:15 following this discussion with Andrew and Jed. If you're keen to join one of those breakout sessions, we'd ask you to rename yourself by hovering over your own video and clicking the 3 dots, clicking rename, and just putting the number of the room that you want to participate, of the room that you want to go into, virtual room, to join that conversation. Room 1 is a conversation about how we tackle underemployment and insecure work. Room 2 will talk about employment services reform, which is a really important issue, given that we want to create full employment and we have an employment services system that doesn't help people find jobs. Room 3 will be talking about rebuilding our manufacturing capacity and looking at industry policy. And room 4 will be a conversation about investing in social, public and community housing. So please take the time to nominate which of those rooms you want to go into so that our wonderful people in tech support can make sure you get to the right place. Without further ado,